Hello, we will now have our next lesson and our intended learning outcome for this day in our lesson in facilitating learning is at the end of the session, 100% of the students with 100% level of proficiency will be able to discuss Gagne's condition of learning. So you all know that we were discussing about the different theories of learning as well as their application to the classroom actual classroom scenarios. So I am assuring and assuming that all of you are learning much so that when you will become a teacher, you can apply in a specific situation one of these theories or the different principles or laws of learning. So today we will be discussing about the Gagne's conditions of learning. Who is this Gagne's? So the full name of Gagne is Robert Mills Gagne. And of course, he is an American educational psychologist, and he became popular because he established the principles for the conditions of learning. He was born, of course, in the United States in 1916 and died, of course, in the age of 80 plus. Okay, and United States, also Tennessee. And his fields of specialization is psychology and of course educational psychology. He had his schooling in Yale University and also practiced in Brown University. According to the theory of Gagne's, we have the three major principles. The first principle is that different instruction is required for different learning outcomes. So when we speak about when we do our instruction in the class, he said that whatever style or whatever method we do in our instruction, there will be it will be required for a learning outcomes, meaning if we are looking into an outcome which is a mental or say for example an affective outcome or a psychomotor, a process of a product, we have to really have a different instruction because each outcome has its appropriate instruction. Later on we will be discussing what specific instruction to different or to a specific outcome. But you all know that in teaching theory-based courses or theory-based subjects, it is different when you teach a skill-based subject or even a teaching PE or physical education is different from teaching, say, for example, social sciences or even in mathematics. So it is we have to remember the first principle of Gagne that different learning outcomes have different instruction. Then number two, there is also learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned in the sequence of instruction. So there are of course different levels of intellectual skills, and each intellectual skills has its sequence of instruction. What are these uh, intellectual skills? So these intellectual skills are in its hierarchy or taxonomy. The first one, we have stimulus recognition. So when we say stimulus recognition, of course, the teacher most of the times will give the stimulus and then the student or the learner will just respond to the stimulus. So keep on remembering our SR theory that we have discussed before. So without the stimulus, according to this theory, there will be no response. So if the student will really identify a very good stimulus, then he will respond to it, to the stimulus. Then we have also the second hierarchy of intellectual skills is response generation. That is response generation. So there are many cases wherein the teacher will ask questions such as how, such as why questions. So this will of course entail or require students to give his own responses to the questions that are being asked by the teacher, or an activity can be planned by the teacher, and then of course students will do the activity. Next hierarchy is the procedure following. So there are, of course, outcome in the different fields of specialization, or even in the different kinds of subjects in the basic education, wherein there are procedures to follow. Say, for example, if you will be asking your students to have an experiment. Of course, in doing the experiment, there must have a clear procedure. Or even in the computation, in some mathematical problems, there must also have procedure. Or most especially when a student is in a practical subject such as homemaking, electronics, they of course will follow certain procedures. Then we have also the fourth, intellectual skills. We have the use of terminology. So it is very important that the terminologies, or the key terms, or the key words, before they will understand the principles, or even the laws regarding the concepts, the concept as in reflected by a term, or by a concept in a word or one concept, it must of course be defined before it will be used properly. Say for example, the word global warming, or global warming, must of course be defined first, so that the student will use it properly. And say for example, you will be asking the students to look for the different habitats of microorganisms. So the word habitat and the word microorganism must be defined first as terminologies, because they are important terminologies for the students to understand what are microorganisms and where do they live and thrive. Then of course, another one is of course discrimination skill. And the student must of course learn how to discriminate a living object to the non-living objects, or they can discriminate an odd numbers or from even numbers, or they can um, discriminate, of course, a virus from a bacteria, and so on and so forth. Then there will also have a concept formation, is another intellectual skills which is higher than the previous intellectual skills that we have already mentioned. When we speak about concept formation, if you are discussing a lesson to the student in the theory of constructivism, the student will now start to formulate or to construct ideas, and those ideas can be considered as concepts that are formed in the mind of the students. So like at this point in time, I'm discussing to you about the principles of Gagne's conditions of learning. So uh, I am assuming that you are really having a mental activity which you can construct concepts, or which you can relate our topic today from your previous lesson, or you are imagining yourself in a classroom and applying some of the concepts that you are learning this day. Next one is of course the rule application. If there are rules to follow and discuss, say for example in geometry there are many rules that will be discussed in say for example in making plan. There are also rules to follow in making a lesson plan. There are, of course, rules that you must comply with. And when you apply them, you must be very careful to follow them in order so that you will always have a very accurate output out of that. And the last one, the highest intellectual skill is, of course, problem solving. The problem solving as the highest the highest in the hierarchy of intellectual skills is being developed when you have, of course, learned the lower hierarchy, or the lower levels of hierarchy in the intellectual skills, because problem solving needs stimulus recognition. It also needs use of terminology to discriminate concepts. Then you are going to formulate formation, concept formation, and so on and so forth. So in order to solve a certain problem, you must of course be familiarizing yourselves with the lower taxonomy, because a problem solving skill is a metacognitive skill, which is of course considered as higher taxonomy. Now, there are also, in order for you to learn these different hierarchies, we will discuss about some conditions. But before we discuss the conditions of learning, let us have now the third principle. And this third principle, as you see on your screen, is events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute the conditions of learning. So there are many conditions wherein Gagne's have already incorporated in the psychology of learning, and these conditions of learning must be observed in order that the learning process will perform effectively in our students, even though they will be taught in different domains such as psychomotor or affective or cognitive. All of this must satisfy the conditions of learning. We will be discussing the different conditions of learning as we go on. Now, these conditions of learning, according to Gagne, is an event which should be satisfied or provided necessary conditions for learning and serve as the basis for designing instruction in selecting appropriate media. So when you become a teacher and you already master the different conditions of learning, the conditions of learning will be the basis of designing instruction. When we say designing instruction, this pertains, of course, to the how you're going to develop the lesson which you have formulated in your, say there is a lesson plan. So in the lesson plan, you have there the objectives of the lesson plan, then you have the materials or the concept, then in the third one is of course the development, because in the science of learning, you have to be very familiarizing yourselves with the three major science of learning of instruction. One is the opening activity, second is the developmental activity, and the third is the concluding activity. When we speak about designing instruction, you have to satisfy these three: how you will open the class, then how will you discuss or develop the new lesson, and of course how will you close. And the opening, the developmental, as well as the concluding or the closing part of the class or the session must comply with the different conditions that Ganes have formulated in his theory. Events should satisfy or provide necessary conditions for learning and serve as the basis for designing instruction, as well as in selecting appropriate media. When we speak about selecting appropriate media in a classroom scenario, this pertains to the different materials that you're going to use. Are you going to use an audiovisual aid, or are you going to use an electronic gadget, or are you like today that we are using the Google Meet or the Zoom in this case, of course, is this, the question is the Zoom or the Google Meet appropriate media for teaching you the different, the Gagne's conditions of learning? So that's one very typical or very good example as we are discussing this time. In short, these three principles must be incorporated according to Ganes for a very effective teaching and learning process. And most often than not, according to him, the theory of conditions of learning will really give a very good performance in the aspect of the teaching, and of course how the students will perform in the class if you will apply the different conditions of learning. So let us now have, before we discuss the conditions of learning, you must familiarize yourself in the 5 categories of learning. So under these categories, we have the first one, which is called the verbal information. What I am doing right at this time, I am giving you verbal information. Now, this is an example of verbal information where facts, concepts, Then of course, procedures and principles are being discussed with you. So in the facilitating of learning in your course, in the EDOC Proof 2, you are learning much of the concept, you are learning much of the principles as well as the how to apply them in your class when you become a teacher. So it is very obvious that when you do a weekly activity or when I ask you to do an assignment, there is always has a classroom scenario, because I want you at this point in time to imagine yourself that you are handling a class wherein uh, you are applying the different principles and the different procedures which I am giving you in this lecture. We call this as verbal information. Now, when you are doing a verbal information as one category of learning, you have to satisfy the following conditions. And these are the conditions which Ghanese have formulated. In verbal information, number one, you have to draw attention to the distinctive features by variation in print or speech. So meaning, when you are lecturing or when you are presenting a lesson to your class, and you are the one discussing it, you are the one explaining it, you must of course vary your tones. Sometimes you shout or sometimes you lower your volume to attract your students so that they will pay attention. And of course, when you are writing on the board, sorry that we don't have it now. We don't use the green board to have the lecture, but most often than not, when you do verbal information, you always use the board. But because of the presentation that I have through the PowerPoint in the Zoom, this is a way of helping you in print, or this is a variation in print wherein you are looking at the presentation. Another condition is present information so that it can be made into chunks. So meaning the information that you're going to give to your students must be part by part, little by little, so that your learners or the students will really easily understand what you are giving them during the lecture. Okay. And then, of course, provide a meaningful context for effective encoding of information. So the context means the background. So I've already shared with you some profile of Ganis, and that will give you a background who Ganis is and what was his background in terms of education, and as a theory, what did he do, so that you will have different, a very appropriate or accurate background or context where um, Ganis is coming from in the formulation of conditions of learning. So when you do verbal information as a category of learning, you have to always start with the sharing of the behavioral objectives so that your students will put interest when you share to them the objectives, because that's one condition in verbal information, and that's according to Ganis. Then, of course, provide cues for effective recall and generalization of information. So meaning, when you do verbal information in the actual classroom scenario, not in the Google Meet, you can ask questions while you are discussing so that you can have your students to recall the important concepts or the important principles, and then right after the sharing of the verbal information or the discussion or the lecture, you can ask them for generalization formatively, and of course at the end you do it summatively, so that they will not forget the lecture that you have given them. That's number one, which is verbal information. Next is about intellectual skills. So when you are going to 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 share intellectual skills to your students, these are now the types of intellectual skills before we proceed with the conditions of learning. So what are these intellectual skills? The first intellectual skills is discrimination. What is discrimination? This is a process of discriminating object or distinguishing objects, features, or symbols. So we are helping our students to really discriminate. Say, for example, when in science, we are teaching about living things and non-living things, or dicot and monocot. By discussing the difference of dicot to monocot, or to like trees to herbs or to shrubs, then we are teaching our students discrimination skills under intellectual skills. Okay. Then number two, example of that is the teaching them how to distinguish and add to the even numbers in mathematics. Next, intellectual skills, concrete intellectual skills. This is about identifying classes of concrete objects, features in and events. So we are some examples of this under concrete. Example is picking out red beads in a bowl. So this is for basic education for kindergarten, wherein in a bowl there are beads, and you are asking your students to get um, the red beads in a bowl. Or you can have a game. Say, for example, you are teaching about colors. You touch the object in the classroom with colored brown. So that is one example of concrete objects wherein they can easily classify the object in terms of their color, or the objects in terms of their touch, if they are rough or if they are smooth. So we call that as concrete is intellectual skills. Next is you are also defining concept is also a part of intellectual skills, wherein you are asking your students to classify new examples of events or ideas by their definition. So meaning you are asking your students to define a certain term or a certain word so that they will easily understand it. So it is very useful when you are discussing a new lesson and there are new terminologies or new words, they must be defined, because before you explain a certain lesson or a certain concept, definition, which is lowest in taxonomy in the cognition, must always come first. Then we have the rules as example of intellectual skills. Rules, of course, you apply a single relationship to solve a class of problems. No, when you are applying a certain steps or a certain delimitation. We call that as rules to solve a problem. Example is computing average monthly income. When you ask your students to compute average monthly income, they have, of course, to follow rules. Especially, I remember that in our mathematics and algebra, when you are going to ask your students to subtract integers, there are rules to follow. Do you remember that? That positive numbers, when you subtract, you have to what do you call this? You have to change the sign of the subtrahend, then proceed on addition. That is an example of rules to follow. Or when you do multiplication of integers, when you are, the rule, of course, rule one is when you multiply positive by a positive number, of course, positive similar signs have a positive answers or positive product in multiplication. Those are examples of rules. Next, we have order rules. This is now applying a new combination of rules to solve a complex problem. So combinations of rules. What's that? Example is generating a balance sheet. So in bookkeeping or in accountancy subject, before you can make a balance sheet, you have to apply combinations of rules, because making a balance sheet is a complex problem. No, it is not easy to make because you will be satisfying different rules. Say, for example, the debit in the credit, and then, of course, the expenses or the income, and then if there is a balance or something like that, so that you will know if you have earned for a month or you have lost something, some losses for the month. That is an example of a balance sheet. uh, Okay, so in the intellectual skills, you have to follow the conditions for learning. These are now the conditions for learning when you are teaching intellectual skills such as discrimination to the order rules. What are these conditions? Number one, call attention to distinctive features, meaning if there is a very important aspect of the lesson, you have to emphasize that when you teach intellectual skills. Stay within the limits of working memory. So meaning you have to let your students not to always memorize, but they have to really understand and comprehend what they are studying in the intellectual skills, whatever it is. Three, stimulate the recall of previously learned components of skills. It is very good always that I am always reminding you that in the theory, I think the last theory that we have discussed, that there must always have the new lesson must always be linked to the past lesson, to the previous lesson, so that they will easily understand the new lesson. Number four, present verbal cues to the ordering or combination of components skills. So when we speak about verbal cues, one example of that, of course, is the definition or the characteristics of a certain word, so that they will always know the order or the combination of component skills. Then number five, schedule occasions for practice and spaced review. So you always give your students to to have an exercises, especially when you are wanting them to improve their intellectual skills, especially in the application of the rules, and most especially when they are going to apply many rules or combination of rules when they will be solving complex problems. And then we use a variety of contexts to promote transfer. So meaning when you are giving and enhancing the intellectual skills of your students, always give many examples in different scenarios so that they will always apply where to use that. Say, for example, you are teaching your students to about the odd and even numbers, so you can apply that to traffic. You can apply that when they are in the paying, when they pay their dues, when they go to the cinema, or when they are in the grocery, because odd and even numbers are there, especially in the plates of the car. So those are different contexts so that the students will really have a better understanding, and they can easily apply the concepts that you are teaching them. And this is about intellectual skills. Okay? Uh, Please, if you have question, you can chat it. Next category is the cognitive strategies. What are these cognitive strategy? This is now employing ways to guide learning, thinking, acting, and feeling. So when we speak about cognitive strategies, this does not only pertain to the development of the thought or the mental, but of course in here there is acting and there is feeling. So the combination of the three domains are present in cognitive strategies. Example of that, constructing concept maps of topics being studied. Okay, so we have advanced organizers, as we have already discussed and introduced by Osibel, as the theorist, that the use of concept maps will easy help the learners to really have a good structure in the mind of what you are going to teach them. So when you are wanting to meet this category, the cognitive strategy, these are now called the conditions. Number one, describe or demonstrate the strategy. Okay, so if there is a strategy that you are teaching them, you have to describe or to show how to use it. Provide a variety of occasions for practice during the strategy. So give more exercises, give more opportunities for the students to really understand that strategy, and of course provide informal feedback as to the creativity or the originality of the strategy or outcome. So there must have, of course, an informal feedbacking wherein your students can give his own feedback to the work, to the performance of his fellow student when they are performing or showing the strategy, or not only always the teacher, but of course the students can also have a peer feedbacking. Then we have number 4, we have the motor skills. Now one is the executing performances with the use of muscles. So motor skills is, of course, when you use your muscles, that is more of the psychomotor skills. And example, say for example, dancing skill, singkil, o kaya ay other types of dance, or they will do a gymnastics, that also an example of motor skills. So when you want to meet this category, motor skills, these are the conditions. Number 1, present verbal or other guidance for the executive summary. Meaning when you teach the steps or the different historical background of the dancing kill, you have to really give them an executive summary of that, so that they will know the feelings, how to dance, the background or the history of dancing singkil, so that when they dance it, they will not only memorize the steps, but of course they know the history of singkil. Arranged repeated practice. So you will always remember the law of practice or the law of exercise, wherein these laws are very important for the mastery of a certain skill. Furnish immediate feedback right after the performance, and encourage the use of mental practice. Oh, that's very good. So when you are dancing or when you are going to recite a poem, you always do a mental practice before you execute it in using your muscles. Okay. And the last one is called attitudes. What are these attitudes? It's choosing personal action based from internal states of understanding and feeling. So what you have put there in their minds, what you have taught them in the intellectual skills, it will of course appear in their attitudes. And when we speak about attitudes, this is more of the affective domain. So example is to decide not to drink soft drinks. No, that's one example. Or say, for example, if they see a waste on the street, are they going to pick up the waste? Or if they see a lolo or lola going to walk on the street, are they going to help or they will not help the lolo or the lola? That's an example of attitude. Say, for example, here in our Google Class, are you going to really focus on the discussion, or you will just watch the recorded video? It's up to you. But anyway, when you are wanting to develop a very good attitude for your students, these are now the conditions for learning. 1, establish an expectancy of success associated with the desired behavior, meaning always be positive, that there are always rooms for improvement in the attitude of your students. Assure students identification with an admired human model. So role modeling. Always mention some VIPs or some popular personalities so that they will model them. Say, for example, their parent, their teacher, the principal, or even the actor, even the politicians, if they are worth being a model, so don't hesitate to use them as an example. Arrange for communication or demonstration of the choice of personal action. So meaning, have a performance-based assessment to look at if they really express as they value a certain attitude until that value will become a character. No, you remember our taxonomy of affective domain. Until they reach it, the attitude or the behavior is automatic and a part of their lives, and that is their character. Give feedback for successful performance or allow observation of feedback in the human model. So always feedbacking is a part of learning process. Now, there must always have a feedbacking. Okay. Now we have also the so-called instructional skills. What are these instructional skills? Meaning, when you are going to teach one of the 5 categories of learning, you have to follow these instructional skills. So these are the skills that you have to possess as a teacher. How you're going to teach, say for example, that certain um, that certain category of learning, even if it is about attitudes, about motor skills, about cognitive strategies, so on and so forth. So you have to develop to yourself this instructional skills. So there are steps to follow. Number one, gaining attention. So when you start a lesson, be sure that you have gained the attention of your students or learners. Say for example, your objective is to identify triangles. So the first step, say for example, that's our objective, to identify triangles. So to gain them the attention, all you have to do is to show pictures of triangle. Then after the gaining of attention, the second step is informing learners of the objectives. So in the objectives, you always remember the taxonomy. So at this point in time, say for example, our objective is at the end of the lesson, the 100% of the students with 100% level of proficiency will identify triangles, will be able to identify triangles. So after you have gained their attention in a motivational activity, you can show them uh, pictures, or you can show them actual objects that are triangle in shape. Okay, so give them the objectives here. The objectives is classify triangles. Next, after you have told them the objectives, step number 3 is stimulate recall or prior learning. So as what we are doing in our class, I always ask you to remind your classmates what we have discussed last meeting. And maybe one example here is they have discussed previously about the square. So take time, short time to review about square so that the students will now have that connection, the link between the new lesson to the past lesson. Presenting the stimulus or selected perception, meaning an example here is you are now going to characterize what a triangle is. A triangle has 3, of course, sides. It has also 3 angles. You have to characterize so that they can easily, that's about presenting the stimulus. Next, provide learning guidance or semantic encoding. You discuss now the kind of triangles, wherein the students will be learning many things about triangle. The providing learning guidance now will be the body of the lesson, wherein you are going to develop the concept, or you are going to develop your objective here. The much of the discussion and explanation will happen in number 5. Then after that is you are going to elicit performance, or you are going to, of course, to further increase the learning ability or the learning performance of your students. You have to let them show what they have learned by question and answer, or you can do formative assessment, such as to elicit responses from your students. Then not only that, but providing feedback. No, The providing feedback now is, of course, a reinforcement. You can give them exercises on board. You can give them in the exercises in the use of games for them to get the triangles, or to look at the say for example the teacher has posted different pictures of triangles in the room. They are going to collect the triangles, and that's an example of feedback wherein the pupils uh, will really know how to classify triangles from different figures. Then the next, number 8, of course, will be the assessment or the quiz for you to assess if your objective is actualized in that session. And the last one is you have to do the enhancement, retention, and transfer, or generalization, or you can by means of giving them assignments, by giving them a reinforcement in the class. Say for example, you ask them uh, to draw a certain object which is shape, or you can ask your pupil that when they are already in the room, they count the number of objects that are shaped triangle, or you can ask them to have that cell phone to picture an object which is shaped triangle. Okay, so these are now the instructional skills. So please remember number 1 to number 9, because this skill is very uh, necessary, very important in whatever topic that you're going to discuss, and whatever specialization that you are in. In your activity, you are going to apply this instructional skill. I think you will be asked in your class as your classwork for the weekly output that you are going to apply this in a classroom scenario, which is of course in line with your specialization. Okay, that's our topic for today, and I there you are going to have a quiz about the topic which was discussed last meeting, and of course the topic which we have just discussed today. So enjoy working on your Google Classroom. See you